Fantastic, let's get started. I think what I might do is just start my video for a moment so that you can see that we're not just disembodied voices here. Hopefully you guys can see me. Hello there. Let me go on to the next slide. Hopefully I can do that. There we are. So my name's Daisy Bland. I'm one of 3 directors at Action Learning Associates. I'm new to the company, so I'll just introduce myself briefly. I'm a learning and development specialist, and I've increasingly specialised in action learning over the past 12 years since I first found out about it, because I've seen the exciting change it can create for people and the movement it can make. So I'm hoping to share some of my enthusiasm with you over the course of the next 45 minutes. With me on the call is Ruth Cook, founder and managing director of Action Learning Associates, and I'm very glad she's here. She's one of the real gurus of action learning in this country, certainly, and actually globally as well. So we're lucky to have her with us. She's going to help answer our questions at the later part of the session. And also on the line, as you've heard already, is Genevieve and Klaus, who are here to help us from the tech side of things. Fantastic. Okay, so that's your team for today. I'll turn off the video so it's not distracting, but nice to see you all as a real person. This is the plan for the session. Let's see if this is going to load. There we go. I think I'm going to try and answer 3 questions for you, which are these. What is action learning? For those of you who haven't heard about it at all, it looked like there were some. How does it work in practice? And then once we've got that covered, how can it be applied in the real world? And some of that might feel relevant, I hope, to your lives, your working lives. The checking in question was to think about, just for a moment, what you want to take away from today's session. And if it's helpful to make a note of any questions you've got stored up for later, please do that now. Okay. So the first question I promised to try and answer for you was this. What is action learning? Let's start with the basics. So the person who founded action learning, who created the format, is called Reginald Revens. And in the 1940s, he put together the concept of action learning, the process, and he used this equation to explain what the point of it is. Okay, so L in the equation stands for learning. I'll give you the subtext. So learning, L is learning, and P is what he described as programmed knowledge. So when he talked about that, what he meant was all the information that we get, the theory that we have in our minds from a learning educational context, and the experience we have in our lives, he called our programmed knowledge. Questioning insight is what you get to do in action learning. So that's where you take the time to stop and reflect on what you're taking in, knowledge and experience. And from that, he argued, that's where true learning comes from. Hopefully that makes sense. So action learning is not a training program. It's not a program where you sit and get lots of advice or discussion from your peers. Rather, it's a structured process for reflecting on your experience and using questioning insight to make sense of the experience and the knowledge that you have. And from that, hopefully, true learning can come. Okay, so it's a self-managed learning technique, and it uses the techniques that you might have come across in coaching or those kinds of settings to make the learning happen. I'll explain that a bit more in a moment. Okay, so how does it work in practice? A facilitator, an action learning facilitator, will help you set up in a group that's called a set in action learning. That's normally 5, 6, 7 people sitting in a circle who, with the help of the facilitator, will take some time to check in on how they're doing, understand as a group what's on their mind, and then decide together for the hour or the 3 hours or 5 hours that they're together, what are they going to work on. The principle is that they focus on one challenge, concept, subject at a time, focusing on one person. So the beginning of a session, once you've got through that setup process, will go like this. The person who's been agreed by the group is going to present first. We'll describe the situation or challenge on their mind. Let's take an example of someone called Bob, and he's got a meeting tomorrow with someone in his team who wants to start working part-time because they've just had a baby. Okay, now for them it makes a lot of sense, but for Bob it's a real business challenge. He doesn't know what to do. There's obviously legal implications, ethical implications, and he's trying to figure out how he's going to go forward with this. He sits in the circle with the rest of the action learning set, and they start to, once they've understood the challenge, understood the situation, they start to ask him questions to help him reflect on what his options are, what the different perspectives involved might be, help him gain new clarity and understanding by giving him that time to do questioning insight, to get new insight into the situation. As he reflects, as the other people in the group listen to him asking questions, they're also learning and drawing experience from what they're learning of Bob's situation and also their own. Gradually, Bob will get to a point where he's explored all the options for the way forward. Is he going to do A, B, or C? And he says to the group, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I've had this time to reflect. This is my plan. Everyone else in the group will then take a bit of time to feed back to Bob. They'll say, you know, this is what I noticed about what you said. This is what stood out to me. This is a similar experience that I had, things like that, to help him get an extra level of mirroring and understanding on the situation, help him understand it from some more perspectives. He will then go off, take the action. He'll have the meeting the next day and do whatever he's going to do in that scenario. And at the next meeting, he'll come back and be able to say to the group, this is what happened. And if needs be, it can be an iterative process. He might present on the same challenge again in a future meeting. Okay, that's what it comes down to. That's the core of action learning, that I've just described. Of course, it can be applied in lots of different settings. So the last question I wanted to take you through is how it can be applied. This is something, as you can see, there's lots of different options. An absolutely core application of action learning is in individual development. So this is something, I don't know, there will be other people on the call in the same scenario. I've used action learning for myself many times over the years. As an individual, you can join a group and use it to further your career, to think about your strategic challenges, etc. In an organizational context, you can also use it to develop, so let's say you've got a cohort of peers at a different level who want an extra bit of learning and development, or you think that would be good for them. So you might have a graduate program in your organization. You might have some rising stars who you want to develop to be ready to join a higher level of strategic management. Action learning can work fantastically to give them the peer support and the challenge and development that they need to take the next step. Action Learning Associates, we do a lot of work. You may have heard of the CLAW Social Leadership Programme. We run programmes, action learning within that programme for both emerging leaders, newer people in the social sector, and people who are experienced and working at a more senior level. So that's the individual development side of action learning. Organizational development is another option. So let's say you've got a big shift in your organization, there's a merger taking place, or a new set of corporate values coming in, or a new strategy or a restructure. You can use action learning to help embed that in the company culture in a more real way. So a few years ago, for example, L'Oreal bought The Body Shop, and we helped them use action learning sets made up of people from across the two companies to help build an aligned culture and share best practice and embed that merger. So that's a sort of classic use of action learning in an organizational development context. Business projects is something where you might want to focus it a little bit more. So if you had a strategic challenge and you wanted to have a bit of time for people to do that questioning insight, reflect on what they're learning, and drive a particular bit of the business forward, you can do that too. So at Sainsbury's a little while back, we did some work on sales strategies. So a group focused on this would come together to develop, in the action learning context, their strategy for a new sales plan, go out and try it, and then come back iteratively at the next meeting to assess how it went and develop the project. Social change is a big part of the work we do. In fact, I'm going to just hand over to Ruth, if we can get the tech to work, to say a quick word on that, give us an example. Ruth, can you come in on this?
Yes, so you've already mentioned the CLAW Social Leadership Fund, where
yes,
emerging and experienced leaders contribute to use action learning to review their development. I would also say there's an example in the climate emergency where we're running a number of action learning sets for people who have agency in the climate emergency, who perhaps are quite senior in organisations, and they can talk about what are they doing and learn from other sectors. And one more example from this would be training young women to become leaders, and part of that would be using action learning in their communities. So a program we did for Oxfam in Lebanon with Lebanese and Palestinian young women. That's a variety of answers for that one, examples for that one. Thank you, Ruth. That's fantastic. So, I mean, I turn to Ruth on that one because it's a core of what we do as an organisation, and there's some exciting stuff that's been happening over the years. Thanks, Ruth. Networking is another opportunity, another thing you can work on with action learning. So you can do that within an organisation, as it says, or across a sector. One sort of classic project for us in this area is getting chief executives of charities together. Can be often a lonely and difficult job to lead a charity or any organisation. And there's a couple of foundations, the Association of Charitable Foundations and the Lloyds Bank Foundation, that bring us in to facilitate groups so that those individuals at the top level can come together and get some strategic and moral support in those roles. Higher education is a growing area for action learning. Lots of universities use action learning a lot. Liverpool University, for example, got us in recently to train a bunch of facilitators to do action learning on all of their business courses, business masters courses, I think it was. So that's a sort of growing area, more universities doing that. And supervision is another one. So I don't know if any of you on the call are involved in coaching or social work, psychotherapy, conflict resolution. All of those types of careers tend to have some element of supervision, and lots of it increasingly is done using action learning. We do that as well for people who are senior action learning facilitators. So there's a sort of quick whiz through lots of the different ways that you can put action learning to use, and hopefully some of them feel relevant to the context that you're in. And the last thing I wanted to show you before we go to questions is something about the benefits. We've touched on some of them. I'll split this into individuals and organisations because it can feel a bit different, I think, across the two contexts. So if you're an individual joining a set, whether it's in an organisation or on your own as a freelancer, for example, you get some structured reflection time. You get time to do that questioning insight, think about the experience and theory that you've got and how to make sense of it. You get support and challenge from the people in your group and strong peer relationships. It's quite a rare context, actually, that you can be honest, uncertain, a little bit vulnerable in a professional context. And action learning is a space where that's really sort of baked into the process. So the relationships that come from that can be quite powerful. Constructive feedback, I suppose, is has become a bit of a euphemism, hasn't it? It's but this means it in the true sense. You get positive feedback from the group when they can see things that you're excelling in, and they're also a good action learning set, well facilitated, will help you hear more difficult truths as well, what areas you might be missing or what you might be able to take responsibility for, that kind of thing, help you see your blind spots. You spend a lot of time learning and picking up insights and best practice from the other people in your set. So that happens by osmosis, and again, sort of inevitably as part of the process. You pick up bits of best practice and new approaches. And then all the while you're developing these core skills that are so important in so many different contexts. You'll develop skills such as how to ask open questions, how to give feedback powerfully, how to reflect and sort of take ownership in a different way of your working life and sometimes your personal life as well. If you're an organisation bringing action learning in, it can seem quite challenging to find, a few hours at a time for people to do action learning, and it can seem like a big investment of people's energy in that way. But the benefits can be quite powerful as well, and this is a little summary as I see them. You get teams with those core skills I just listed developed. That can't be a bad thing. You get people in the organisation taking ownership in a slightly different way, because the actions in action learning are always focused on what the individual presenting can do, rather than whose fault this is or who else can help me. Participants tend to take ownership in a slightly different way.
Of course, they're also resolving issues and finding different ways to achieve their objectives during the session. So that's great for the business. And culture and behaviour can change gradually over time if the action learning is set up in a powerful way. You get learning, of course, and networks building across the organisation. You get a culture of learning and growth. I'm skipping to the last bullet point there, so that this kind of way of reflecting and questioning experience is embedded in the way that people are working. And the last point I just wanted to mention is the self-sustaining idea. So you can set up action learning after, say, 5 or 6 facilitated sessions with a paid facilitator. You can train a group in quite a light touch way to facilitate themselves going forward. So they don't need an external person coming in. They can go on and facilitate themselves, or come and train as facilitators if they want to take that a bit further. So it can sort of be a type of development that extends off into the future as well. So there's a whistle-stop tour through what action learning is all about. Thank you all for bearing with us through those technical challenges. I think that is my last sort of output slide, and I want to hear from you now about what's on your mind. What are the questions that's provoked, or the questions that you came with? And what I'll do, depending on what comes in, I've had some submitted in advance as well, and I'll try and choose the ones that I think will be most likely to be useful for the group. Let's have a look here. Okay, so we've got 3 already. In what ways do you run a set differently when applying action learning to organisational development or a business project? Ruth, this might be a good one for you. Can you see the questions there?
Yes, but we've also had a lot of questions in the chat screen. So it'd be helpful if people put future questions from this point onward. Could you put them in the Q&A rather than in the chat screen? But I've made a note as we've gone through of different ones from the chat screen, so we can pick up on some of those, and maybe I'll refer some of them back to you, Daisy. So the difference between using it for OD purposes or for a business project. So when it's in a business project, you might have an action learning set where everyone's working on a different project or a different challenge, and they would use time within the action learning set either to work on a common challenge or to report in and talk about the things that they're finding difficult in their individual business projects. When it's an organisational development purpose, then you would have that as the theme running through action learning. So it might be, for example, it very often is implementing change. So, for example, we worked in the civil service a lot when they were implementing the big changes to the way civil servants worked. So that's the theme, and you ask people to choose topics related to that theme, and you might set it up with an organisational sponsor, and you might be reporting back on the themes that emerge. So the process is similar, but the purpose is obviously different, and you build that into the structure. We've had quite a few questions about timing and whether you can do a condensed session for action learning. So Rosanna asks, can you do it in 1 to 2 hours? Can I pass that one to you, Daisy?
Well, that's something we quite often talk about, isn't it? About, people often find it a challenge to find a longer session than that. My experience, I don't know, I'll be interested to hear what you think, Ruth, but it depends how experienced the group is as to how quickly they can do it. There are ways you can edit the session, alter the technique to help it be a sort of more quick fire. My set now, just as an example, we tend to meet for a 2-hour meeting now because we're finding we can fit that in more regularly, and we are able to get through 1 or sometimes 2 presentations. The difference really is how much you want to be able to cover in each session. When a set that's an experienced set, though, once a set is first starting, you do need a bit of time to build the trust and get the process up and running. So, I mean, ideally, Ruth, I wonder if you'll agree, we'd try and set up a 3-hour session to start off, but we have done 2 hours to start as well. What do you think, Ruth?
Yes, we often get asked, can we do it in 1 hour? And it's really hard to do it in 1 hour. And we really try and encourage people to do a minimum of 2 hours, ideally 3 hours online. when we first started, we'd do them for whole days, and it seems like that's pretty difficult to get agreement to doing these days. But if you're meeting face to face, maybe have the first meeting as a whole day meeting, because you want to spend longer getting to know each other, understanding the process before you get going. And in fact, Vanessa has asked, how does session 1 work? And how do you get a balance of sharing content and making it experiential? Do you want to answer that, Daisy, or shall I?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I understand the question between experiential, because I mean, the whole thing's experiential. I'm not sure I follow the question. Do you have a sense of it, Ruth?
I think what Vanessa means is, for that intro session, how much would you spend time talking about action learning and what it is, and how much get into doing it and have an experiential session as part of day 1?
Yeah.
And I think my answer would be that you want to minimize the amount of time you spend talking about it and maximize the amount of time people get to doing it. But you obviously need to describe the process, describe the ground rules, and then get people to introduce themselves. And we use particular exercises to get them to introduce themselves at length. And then you can do some action learning. So that's why it's helpful if the first session is a bit longer. And in fact, I promise she's not a plant, but Esther has asked, how do I train as a facilitator? Daisy, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so I'll come on to this actually after the Q&A, but it's an absolute core of what we do. So you can either run, it depended if you want to come as an individual, in which case you can join one of our open courses that anyone's welcome to join, and you can see details for that on our website or send me an email. Or you can run it within your organisation. So if you wanted to train up 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or more facilitators in the team, we can come and do an in-house programme for you there.
And what about action learning in multi-sector contexts? Mike asked about that.
Try and find that question.
It's right back at the beginning of the chat.
Oh, right. Yeah. So do you mean, so working across with people in different sectors in the same action learning set? I'm going to guess that that's what you mean, Mike.
Yes.
That works fantastically well. I mean, the parameters for each set can be different. So you can have people working very specifically, like the climate example Ruth gave, and someone's actually asked for a bit more detail on that, Ruth. Or you can have people coming together to talk about whatever's on their mind, and that could be something quite different. So what you find is that across sectors, the challenges and themes that come up often play across different contexts. And if you have someone there who's, let's say, a financier and someone in the group who's a social worker, that can be quite powerful, because they tend to ask questions from those different perspectives. And I mean, that's the joy of action learning in a way, is the different types of brains on any one scenario mean that you get a more non-linear creative process rather than the linear experience of being coached one-to-one. So I think it can work in summary, but obviously the breadth, the context, the content of the sessions would be more varied and wide-ranging if you had people in different sectors.
So Anne Wallace has asked a really interesting question. What's the difference between action learning and a peer support group?
Interesting. Do you want to take that one, or shall I?
I'll give you my first thoughts on it, and you can add to it. Well, I've often worked with groups who have been peer support groups and then say, actually, we need more structure. And what's happened is that they've turned into a bit of a moaning shop. You know, they get together and all talk about how difficult it is, how lonely it is, how challenging it is, and they may not be focusing on what am I learning and what's the action I'm going to take. So the structure of action learning offers an equality of space, if you like, through the bidding process for different participants, but it also forces people to structure their thinking, to reflect more deeply, and to come up with some actions, and then report back on their actions to the group. So they become accountable to the group, not just for getting some support, but being challenged in their thinking and coming back with some answers of what they've done differently. Anything you wanted to add?
No, I think that's spot on, Ruth. I think that balance of challenge and support is where action learning gets exciting. Where, you know, if you can get to that place with a group that feels safe enough, and that's why we take a bit of time to get to know each other at the beginning of the session, the beginning of the set. If it can feel safe enough to be challenged, it can be exciting in a slightly different way to a support group.
And okay, Imke has, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrongly. How are these sessions different from regular meetings set up for a project? Is it about learning the skills you discussed? Is it about open questions or giving feedback? Or is there something else I'm missing? So how is it different from regular meetings for a project, reporting back on a project?
Shall I answer that?
Please.
Yeah, so, I mean, the difference is quite dramatic in a way. If you sit in an action learning group, it will feel very different to a meeting because of the structure that I described before and that Ruth just touched on again, that there's no space for general discussion, for things to sort of fall into a general sharing of opinions as you would have in a meeting. The accountability section is held quite tightly at the beginning of the session, and then the process will move on to focus on what's top of the agenda for that particular day. No point is there an opportunity for the thing to sort of descend into what might feel like a meeting or a conversation, because even the feedback section, where we've heard what the presenter, let's say Bob again, has to say, we've asked him questions, even the feedback process is highly facilitated. So each person will speak once. Bob has a chance to listen, take what he wants from it, and then we move on. So in that sense, quite different things come out than would be able to come out in a meeting place where often louder voices predominate, for example, and the process is less managed. Would you add anything, Ruth?
No, that's great answer. Returning to timing, Caroline has said, I've read in some articles that sessions are usually around 30 minutes after the intros have taken place. And I guess I'd say, Caroline, lots of things are called action learning that aren't. That, you know, that there are some versions of action learning which are really minimal and almost like sort of just a group think session. But our structure is very different. It's based on Reg Evans's original work on action learning, and it definitely isn't a 30-minute session. What about the difference between action learning and a community of practice? Sarah Watson asks.
I don't know the answer to that. Do you know, Ruth?
I've certainly worked with some groups who have then formed themselves into a community of practice. This wasn't work that we did ourselves, but within the Commission, the European Commission, they had such sets, and the facilitators met in a community of practice as an action learning set and to evolve their learning as they went along. So I think a community of practice is often looser and the structure is less rigid than an action learning set, but obviously they are about, and sometimes they're much bigger, but obviously it's based on similar principles of creating a structure where peers can learn from each other. Jane asks, do we take a blended approach, i.e. online and in person? And do we operate in Ireland? Okay.
So I guess the answer to that is yes and yes. We've been working online for a lot, way before the pandemic struck. So we were quite happy in doing all of our courses online and also facilitating action learning sets online before the pandemic happened. So that is something that works well. I think Ruth would agree there's sort of slight differences to working online and in person and benefits to both, but that absolutely works. And in terms of working in Ireland, we can do that in person, I think. Ruth, you'll have to confirm, and certainly online as well. Yeah,
we've been working with a group of people who are hoping to set up action learning in Ireland, so it's on its way, but we can also send an associate there until that's happened. Okay, the importance of the facilitator in action learning, Wesley asks.
Hello, Wesley. We are, so the facilitator. The facilitator is an interesting role in action learning. They will act as an equal in the group, in the sense that they'll participate in the open questions and the reflection just like anybody else. Their job, particularly with a group that's settled in and light touch. So let me start from the beginning. When a group begins, they will be the one who explains what action learning is all about, make sure people know the process and are comfortable with one another, with some facilitated exercises. Once the process starts, they act as an equal member of the group to ask questions, as I say, and feedback, but they've got this extra role, which is to hold the space and make sure that the person presenting feels comfortable and safe and has a good level of support and challenge as needed. So they're the person who's managing the practicalities, like the time, but also doing what's needed, asking questions or intervening if needed, to make sure that the process feels productive, safe, productive and safe for the person presenting.
So we had a question: can you train as a facilitator without having experienced action learning? And the answer is definitely yes. And our open programs tend to be varied between some people who have experienced it and some who haven't, and that's a value. And within, another question is about the 3 days, and do people get to experience action learning during that 3 days? So yes, the whole 3-day program is built around each person being in all of the roles, so both being a facilitator and being a presenter, but also being a set member, so that they move between those roles and they get feedback on their facilitation skills, and there's some input from the trainer, obviously, and a big resource book that we give you. So it's very much an experiential program with lots of opportunities to practice. And afterwards, well, this isn't a guarantee, but I would say that on the open programs, people quite often form into an action learning set afterwards, or there are some individuals who are interested in becoming an action learning set, and then other people join them, or they find some other people join them. Okay, there's so many questions coming in. Emma's asked, what happens if someone still isn't sure what action they will take after having had the round of questions? Dave, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting, this one. It happens sometimes, doesn't it? And that's okay. I mean, what can happen sometimes is that the space in the action learning session is used for that person to reflect on their options. And then they go away and think about the action that they take away. Might be, well, actually, I need to go away and think about this a bit more. It might be that actually I need to go and talk to somebody else, or get another opinion or expert view. So it might be that the space there is to progress their options further, understand what they need to decide between, and then go off and think about it. It doesn't need to be that the example I gave before with Bob, that's a really difficult, challenging thing, and he may not have settled it in 20 minutes or half an hour of being asked questions. He might need some other input, so that's okay too. So the key element, I suppose, that you're going to want to make sure is that reflection, questioning, insight, but where it takes you to will vary depending on the scenario.
Janice has asked, and apologies we didn't get to it, it was one of the early questions, Janice, how does an individual get involved in a set? So it's not a service that we are able to offer. The International Foundation of Action Learning does offer it. So if you joined IFAL, you could advertise that you're looking for a set to join, or you could, or people sometimes advertise within IFAL for where they're looking for other people to join them. But there isn't an organisation that offers that service. There used to be many years ago, but it called Set Match, which was great, but it no longer exists. And I think when you mentioned earlier, you said you're an administrator, and I think that's right, that quite often administrators get left out when it comes to setting up action learning in leadership programs, for example, but it would be a really useful thing to do. Anne has asked, can you say a bit more about the benefits of online versus face-to-face action learning sets and vice versa?
Yes, and this might have to be our last question actually, because I want to make sure we wrap up on time. Unless there's another burning one, Ruth, you want me to bear in mind?
Well, I think this one could be the last one. That's
might have to be the last. It's a good one, yeah. Online versus face-to-face. So, as I said, there's some slight differences. The power of being face-to-face, which I fear will be endangered now we've all realised how much you can do online, is I don't know, there's an alchemy of real bodies in the room where we tend to work without a table in the middle. If you can imagine people sitting in a circle, looking at one another, there is a total focus. Usually we'd have no papers in the group at all. Everybody would be sitting just themselves, no distractions, and able to focus entirely. Now that's powerful and unusual. If any of you have ever had the experience of psychotherapy or coaching or one of those other spaces that are designed for pure reflection, it can be powerful and rare. There's also something about people having to travel there, make the commitment to be there, that it becomes more of a sort of thing in people's day, and that can while it's more challenging, it can also mean that people are able to work a bit more powerfully together. Online, you have the benefit of it being more cheaper to organise, easier to get to. You know, it's something that you can do irrespective of pandemics, etc. And there's some people, and this can be a personality thing, I think, find it a bit easier to reflect if they're sitting in a room on their own. I think some people find that a bit more peaceful, a bit less, a bit more of a powerful space to reflect. So that can vary person to person. There are challenges with both, of course, but in my experience, working in both settings, they both work pretty well, and the core sort of process of action learning translates completely. There's nothing that you lose online other than that sense of physical presence. Would you add anything to that, Ruth?
No, I've just been looking back through the chat and the Q&A to see how many questions we missed, and I realise there's one on higher education that we didn't answer, Michelle. So do feel free to email me or Daisy if you want, and we can get back to you on that. And for anybody else who hasn't had their question answered, because there's been some great questions in there, so please feel free to email us.
Yes, thanks so much for all these questions. It's absolutely fantastic. And someone's asked for my email address. I'll put it up in a minute. And I think you've got Ruth's in the email, in the reminder email as well. No matter how much I've explained. Fantastic. Yes, some other conversated questions there about the challenge of time in organisations. It's a big one. Okay, let's just wrap up. Let's see if my computer's going to cooperate. Here we are. I just wanted to show you this screen. A reminder of, we talked about it a bit, what we do as an organisation. The core of what we do is action learning tailored to particular organisations, different contexts, sometimes cross-sector settings as well. So if any of that, those applications we talked about felt relevant and you want to get in touch about that, please let me know. My email address is on the bottom of the screen. And the other thing we do at the heart of our work is training new facilitators to go off and use action learning around the place. And you can see information about that on our website, or email me at the email address there. We also do various short courses when they come up and they feel relevant to the people we're working with. We're doing one at the moment, for example, on virtual facilitation for pandemic-related reasons. That's an online course. Everything else we do is offered online or face-to-face. So yeah, and that's sort of back to useful post-pandemic, well, hopefully post-pandemic now. And if you look on our website or our YouTube channel, there's loads of other videos, webinars and blogs, including opportunities to see action learning played out in real life on webinars and on the YouTube channel. So if you still feel like you'd like to see it in practice before going further, that might be a good place to go. Fantastic. It's been lovely to spend this time with you guys. Before you go, I'd really appreciate if you could just fill in our closing poll that Genevieve will put up, just to give us a tiny bit of information before you head off, and I'll leave this screen up for you to do that. So I think all that remains to me to say, other than that, is thank you so much for your time. I hope you have found this useful for where you're at, and stay in touch with us in whatever way makes sense for you. Thanks very much.